Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar from Edureka on React Redux Forms. A little introduction about mine. My name is Vipul Jain. I have total 7 years of experience in SharePoint, Office 365, Microsoft Azure, and other client-side related technologies, libraries, and frameworks, for example, Angular and ReactJS. So before going ahead, I want to just clear it out that we are not talking about here just React forms, because that contains only the basic controls, the HTML controls. We will be talking about the React plus Redux forms over here. As we know in React, HTML form elements work a little bit differently from the DOM elements as in React, because form elements naturally keep some internal state. They keep some internal state, normal HTML form elements. So React forms and React plus Redux forms are very much different. So this needs to be cleared it out here itself in the first go, that the React forms which we created earlier are very much different from the React plus Redux forms which we are going to see in this particular webinar. So going forward, I am assuming that everyone who is viewing this webinar is having the basic understanding of the React.js, its functionality, that what are the components, props, state, lifecycle methods available in React.js. Because this is an advanced topic in learning React.js. So before starting with Redux forms, or specifically React Redux forms, let's talk about a little bit about what is Redux and what are its features. So going forward now from here, we'll talk about a little bit about the Redux, because it's very important to understand Redux because it is altogether separate from React. We are combining here the React functionalities and the Redux functionality. So first of all, let's go ahead and talk about a little bit about the Redux. Now, what are the objectives for this particular webinar is that why we are using these Redux forms, why they are required, because we have React form elements available, then why we are using the Redux forms. Then we'll talk about what is a Redux form, its functionality and its working, how it works, what are the various features available in a Redux form, React Redux form, for example, fields, how we do the validations on submissions, and then we will do some hands-on based on the synchronous validation. So Redux, let's talk about Redux. So recently you might have heard that Redux is very popular and has become the de facto standard, I must say, because it's very popular nowadays. So for this quick evidence of this statement, so Redux has more stars on GitHub as compared to Flux, which is the earlier version given by the Facebook. So both Flux and Redux are the frameworks given by the Facebook, but as you can see on the GitHub, if you go to GitHub site, Redux has gained more popularity as compared to Flux. It has more number of stars, although both are open source projects from Facebook. So what are the various components which are there in Redux? So Redux have, first of all, in first place, they have actions, then they have reducers, then there is something called store. So we'll talk about all these things very quickly now. So what are actions? Actions are payloads of information that sends data from your application to your store. So store is getting data from actions. They are the only source of information for the store. I repeat here, this is very important to understand in Redux that actions are the only source of information for the store. And just keep in mind one thing while talking about Redux, a Redux can have only one store. We'll see later, but just remember at this point of time that Redux can have only one store, although it can have multiple reducers. But when I talk about store, Redux always has one store. So what this action do? So from action, we send them to the store using a store.dispatch method. So action and store, how they are working, actions are having the information. That information is getting sent to the store. Now, action describe the fact that something has happened, but don't specify how the application state has been changed with respect to response, because this is the function of the reducers. So we define the actions that represents the facts about what has happened and the reducers that update the state according to those actions. Now we'll talk about store. What is a store? So a store is the object that brings all these things together. And then finally the React.js, which comes into picture, works for the view part of the application. So store is the object that is binding all these things together. So store has the following responsibilities. It holds the application state. It allows access to state via getState method. It allows a state to be updated via dispatch method, which takes input as action. Then it registers listeners via subscribe method, and it handles unregistering of listeners via the function which is returned by the subscriber. So all these are the functions of the store. Now, what is the data flow in Redux? By this, what I mean is that how the data, starting from the action till store, and in between we have reducers, and finally ReactJS helps in the view part of the application. How all this happens, we will see in this particular slide. So this is data flow in Redux. So first of all, Redux is architecture which revolves around strict unidirectional data flow. So when I say unidirectional data flow, it means the data is flowing from parent to child. So at the top, we have a parent and it can have multiple child. So data is flowing in one particular direction only. So which means that all the data in your application, it follows the same life cycle pattern, making the logic more predictable and very easier to understand, and also at the same time maintainable also. I can say that it encourages data normalization so that you don't end up with multiple independent copies of the same data. You have data in one place so that those independent copies, earlier what used to happen that we have independent copies of the same data which are not aware of each other. Here we have only one copy of the data and data is flowing in a unidirectional way. So if I talk about the data lifecycle in Redux particularly, it follows 4 steps. There are 4 steps. So first of all, as we saw in the last slide, so we call the store.dispatch, which is taking the input as action. So action which is having the data gets sent to the store. So this is the first step. If I talk about the second step, the Redux store, it calls the reducer function. Reducers are nothing but just the functions. Those are the pure functions. So third step, the reducer, the root reducer, which you have created, it may combine the output of multiple reducers into a single state T. As I said earlier, that in Redux architecture, we need to have only one store, but we can have multiple reducers which combine themselves into a single state tree. The fourth step is the Redux stores saves the complete state tree returned by the root reducer, and finally it sends to the React components to get displayed on our application. So these are the 4 steps. In the next slide, you can see this is the flow which we have just talked about, that at the top we have action which gives data to the store. Store calls reducers continuously. It calls multiple reducers. They combine themselves, and finally the view part of the application is done by the React. So that is a complete data flow, I will say, with particular to Redux. Now, before going towards the Redux forms, I will talk about the main features of Redux very quickly. So what are the main features of Redux? So Redux centralizes all your application state in one store, that we saw, that there is only one store. So Redux is centralizing all your applications state in one store. Second, what are the main features we are talking about? I'm talking about the first one, the Redux centralizes all your application state in one store. Second, Redux enforces keeping all state in a single centralized object graph that we'll see in our demo. The third main feature I can say is that Redux, yes, this is very important. Redux has an immutable store, which means state cannot be changed. Immutability means you cannot change the state or you can update the data. The fourth benefit, you can say that you can instantly see the changes in your browser. So if you are changing something in your browser, if you are giving some input, then you can instantly see those changes in the browser without losing your current client-side state. And also the time travel debugging, I'll say, which allows you to step forward and backward through state. It is very smooth with respect to Redux. Now here, the question comes into mind, when we have React forms, why do I need Redux? Do I really need Redux over here? So now the answer is, that if you're building a very simple application or very simple form, for example, then you can use vanilla JavaScript. However, if you start manipulating the DOM, you start making, let's say, AJAX calls, or you handle the interactivity between the user input and the output, then you can thought of using the jQuery might be. But it is very painful to write code in JavaScript and jQuery. Then you can think of React and Redux. Now React has components. As we all know that React has components, React has virtual DOM, React has synthetic events, pure functions, etc., which helps us managing the complexities of these forms and applications. Now, Again, we have talked about jQuery, we have talked about JavaScript, we have talked about React. Now, why Redux? This is the main question, which still remains unanswerable. Now, to answer this question very quickly, now as data gets more complex in your application or in your form, there are sometimes situations, means when you have to display the same data at multiple places. It could be a scenario that you have to display the same data at multiple places. There may be large state changes that are very hard to manage. Then there may be a requirement, let's say, to handle all the state changes in a single place for consistency. This is where React with Redux forms comes into picture. So where you have to manage the state changes in a single place. And in our case, in this React Redux form, that single place where all the state changes are getting managed is called store. So basically what we saw is that Redux, it works basically on three core principles. The first one is the store, the action, and the reducers. So all your application state is placed in a single immutable store. All your application state is placed in a single immutable store. Second, the only way to mutate the state is to emit an action. You have every time if you want to change the state or update the data, you have to go via an action because it describes a user intent, or I can say it describes a user input, what he needs to do. Then how the state is changed? State is changed by reducers. As you can see in this diagram, state is changed by reducers. Reducers are nothing but are pure functions. So in this diagram, I can say if I go flow by flow, step by step, what it is doing, that this is action, and action describes the user intent. Now the first step is the action. It is an object with some type property and some data. And so action always has a type. You must remember this, that this is the first place in calling the React Redux forms, and action always has a type. Now coming to the reducer part, this is the reducers, which are nothing but the JavaScript functions, pure functions. A reducer always handles the action. So a reducer is just a function that again returns the new state. It takes the old state, returns the new state. So what reducer is doing? Reducer is receiving the current state from the store and an action, and then it returns a new state. Now what next is happening, that reducers typically contains is because we can have many actions. So always remember that reducer functions, since they are JavaScript functions, so reducer always contains a switch statement. These reducers, when I'm going to write these reducers, the functions, the JavaScript pure functions, they always contains a switch statement that checks the type of the action passed, because you are passing an action via store to the reducer. So this determines what new state should be returned. Based on that type, it is determined that what new state should be returned, because reducer, what is the function of reducers we just now talked about? That reducers, they return, because these are functions, so they are returning us the new state. So once this new state is returned from a reducer, this store gets updated. So earlier it was having the old state. The old state has been sent to the reducer, and now the reducer has sent us the new state. Now the store is got updated with the new state. So once this new state is returned from the reducer, the store is updated. So the React components are connected to the store using React Redux. So this is React, from where it will help you in the view part of your application. Now, why use Redux Forms? Let's talk about now React Redux Forms. Redux stores the application state under a single data store, that is your store, which is the immutable store. This allows us to use stateless components, resulting in clarity and also in easier testing. At the same time, Redux allows us to create reducers, which hold a particular piece of application state, as we saw. So if I talk about with the diagram, so this is Redux, React plus Redux. It is having multiple reducers. As you can see in this diagram, there is only one store. You cannot have multiple stores. This is an immutable store, but you can have multiple reducers, which are nothing but the pure JavaScript function. Okay, so why use Redux forms? This was very important, which always comes into my mind, that why you need to build your forms with Redux forms. Why not with any other technology, or with, let's say, React components or React forms elements? Why we have to use the Redux forms? So I'll say that when I usually create forms for my React Redux applications, I tend to keep the value of the inputs on the application state. This is very important. I'm repeating it once again that I tend to keep the value of the inputs. When I say inputs, these are the input controls which I'm giving as a user on my form. So I tend to keep the value of the inputs on the application state with little to no editing, because the forms which I usually create are very simple. I never stopped realizing in fact that what that means. So we are talking about that I tend to keep the value of my inputs on the application state. But why I am doing this? So let's say when I faced a project with more complex form, when the complexity is more with having more complex form requirements, so I started to wonder if it was worth to do all that Redux boilerplate, which I'm doing over here to keep our input value into our application state. So the question is, if it's just a form, do we really need the input values in our application state? Is it required? Because it's a form. So if I talk about the history of the web development, shows a move to increase the responsibility of the client-side application, which in the past was just the HTML and all the work was made on server. Now we have very complex JavaScript applications. This is the today's reality. It's not the responsibility of the server anymore. It's the responsibility of the client-side applications to handle the situation, or which allows us to keep the values of the input on the application state. So now, because since we have very complex JavaScript applications, and these JavaScript applications, they have taken the responsibility from the DOM, as we could see with the famous libraries, for example, jQuery, Angular, and more recently React. Since this last one took the attention from the community, it brought with the concept of, as we saw, that unidirectional data flow, which basically is that the data comes down from the component state, or from the application state more specifically, if you are using a state container like Redux in your UI, and the UI is rendered based on that state. Events, if I talk about events on the UI, events on the UI changes the state, and the new state updates the UI. There comes into the picture the controlled components. So control components, what are control components? Are nothing but just HTML inputs. So the inputs which we are giving on the form that receive its value as a property. So given that application using React and Redux, there are two main options. So first is the implements for each field and event handler, which we used to do, or that is all the Redux stuff, or we could use a library that does all this work for us. So we are talking about here today the Redux Forms library or the React Redux Form. Now what is a Redux Form? Let's talk about Redux Form is an NPM package. That is a node package manager package which helps us build the forms in Redux. Redux Forms saves a lot of boilerplate code. When I'm talking about the boilerplate code, I'm talking about here the Redux code, the native Redux code. It helps us integrate our form reducers into the rest of the applications. As we know now that we have three main components when we talk about Redux: the action, the store, and the reducers. Reducers are nothing but just pure JavaScript functions. So how we do it in Redux form? So first of all, what we do, we import reducer from Redux form package and include it in our combined reducer function. So combined reducer function is given by the React Redux form. So here we have the reducer. Here we have the reducer. This is the React reducer form, and we have in which we have a method called combined reducer. This will altogether combine up to form our application. Now let's talk about fields. What are fields? First, we have to identify the each piece of our application state. So field can have multiple attributes, for example, name, type, component, label. All these are the various attributes which we can give to the field component. Then Redux form package provides a field component. Then we will wrap around each state object with a field component. We also need to connect our component to the form reducer. And all these things we achieve using Redux form function. Now displaying the form, how we display the form in React Redux. So specifically we use a helper function render field, which is here you can see on the screen. Render field is a function which is called by the field component. It is taking the three states. The form has following three states, for example, pristine, default, touched, and error. These are the three states in the sample form. So once the user touches it, will prompt the user with the error message if any input field is left blank. So we'll see when we'll talk about the submit validation. Now Redux form. So the best way to manage your form state in Redux. This is the one line statement which I can say about the Redux form. Once again, I'm talking about the Redux form. So the best way, it is the best way to manage your form state. So when we are creating the forms in React, we should go with React Redux Forms and not simply by the React form elements, because it is the best way to manage your form state in Redux. So if I talk about the Redux form URL, it's always available on internet, and you can see over here, I've opened this. So this is the Redux form website where you can very well go, and you can see there are many APIs, examples, FAQs available for your learning. You can start from here, start here. So this is a complete website of particular Redux forms, or I can say React Redux forms. So here is a URL where you can go, that is https://reduxform.com. So to connect your React form components to your Redux store, so we have two separate things here. First is the React form components, and then the second we have Redux store. We are going to combine all these things to make the React Redux forms. So what all we need? We need the following pieces from the Redux form package. The package which we talked about, the npm package. These three things are required. The first thing, the Redux reducer, that is a form reducer. The second one is React HOC Redux form method. HOC is nothing but high order components. And the other last part is the field components. Now, what are these? We'll see in the next slide. Okay, so these three components are required to combine the React components and the Redux functionalities, the Redux form functionalities. So first talk about form reducer. Form reducer is nothing but a function that tells how to update the Redux store. Because as we saw that we are going to update continuously the store, which is having the updated state or the new state, which is returned from the reducer function. So form reducer is a function that tells how to update the Redux store based on changes coming from the application. And when I say the changes coming from the application, it means the changes which are coming, or the new state which is coming from the reducer, which is returned from the reducer to the store. Those changes, as you can see over here, it is written that those changes are described by Redux actions. Those are actions. The second thing which we require is a Redux form method or the function. So Redux form function, it takes the configuration object and returns a new function. We use it to wrap your form component and bind the user interaction to dispatch of Redux actions. Because as I mentioned earlier, that the Redux store is immutable. Immutable means you cannot change the state because data is flowing in a unidirectional fashion. That is from parent to child. But if you want to change the state of the Redux store, you have to call continuously actions. So the underlying statement is you can only change the state of the Redux store by using actions. There is no other way. The last component is the field component. The field component is a component that lives inside your wrapped form component. We will see in our demo. We use it to connect the input components to the Redux form logic. So these are the three main things. I'm going to the previous slide over here. So we talked about these three things which are required to combine or to connect the React form components to your Redux store. Now Redux forms, how it helps. Redux form is a great option, I'll say. React Redux Forms, it keeps track of all component or the application form state. For example, I'll say that React Redux Form, it handles model value changes from any object or array. It provides utility actions for manipulating the state. It has many actions which we'll see for manipulating the state. And as we have already discussed that how you can change the state, how you can change the immutability store only via actions. Then the third point is that it handles control updates such as focus, blur, pristine, etc. It keeps track of validity on any part of your model. So validations, it always checks the validations if you apply on your form. It allows for completely dynamic and deep forms. It keeps your model state intact, which allows you to have full control of your model reducer. So as we saw in the data flow diagram of the Redux, the action, store, and reducer and the React components, they were very bind together in a very good form so that you have full control of your reducer or your complete application. So as I said, React Form is a great option to do all these things. It keeps track of all common application form state. So when I say that it keeps track of all common application form state, those are that what are the fields that are in the form. It keeps track of the fields that are in the form, the values of each field, then the focused field. If the field values are valid or not, it keeps track of all that. It can give you the validation errors, the fields that the user have interacted with, or it also checks if the form is being submitted or not, and it also check whether it is happening in a synchronous or asynchronous way, or we have to check for synchronous or asynchronous validation. So all these are the various advantages of using React Redux Forms. So now we'll talk about the Redux Forms usage. Step by step we'll go that how, since we have already talked about the React components and we have talked about the Redux features, and now we are going to combine them from this slide. So the first, as I'm going quickly back to the previous slides, the first we talked about the form reducers, then we talked about the Redux form, then we talked about the field component. Now we'll see all these things in detail. Now the form reducer. What is form reducer? It's a function, right? As we mentioned earlier, form reducer, the store should know how to handle the actions coming from the form components. To enable this, we have form reducers which we import from the reducer. So as you can see in the code here, import reducer as form reducer from Redux form. These are all just libraries. These Redux and Redux forms are the libraries which you can very well add in your code. So the store should know how to handle actions coming from the form components. To enable this, we need to pass the form reducer to your store. You have to pass the form reducer to your store. It serves for all your form components, so you only have to pass it once. This is very important to understand. That since it is serving for all your form components. So when I say about form components, you can have inputs, you can have label, you can have text areas, or you can have objects as well. So it is serving for all your form components, but the important point to understand is that you only have to pass it once. As you can see over here, I'm only passing it as once, form reducer. So now your store knows how to handle the actions coming from the form components. So as you can see over here, you have to pass the form reducer under the form key. This is a by default key, a default key which is available. If you want to have your custom keys, you have to look up the docs for get form state. So this is the first step. The first step is to enable the form reducer to your store, or to pass the form reducer to your store. Now we'll talk about the second step. What is the second step? Is the form component. So now we have the form reducer in place, which we are passing to the store. Now we have form components. To make your form component communicate with the store, we need to wrap it with Redux form. So as you can see, I'm going to the previous slides. There is a function called Redux form. So first we talk about the form reducer. Now I'm talking about the Redux form. So to make your form components, so we have the form components in place now, but how we enable it to communicate with the store, we need to wrap it. We need to wrap around it with the Redux form function. It will provide the props about the form state and also the function to handle the submit process. So as you can see on the code over here, so in this code, what I'm having a form state which is passing as contact. This is unique. So once we have the form component ready, we can add some inputs over here. So this is all about the form components. Now Redux form usage step 3. Now the step 3 is the field component. Again, I'm going to the previous slide which we talked that what is the third component which we have to add is the field component, which lives inside the wrapped form components, which we did that we have wrapped the form component in the Redux form function. So form field components. The field components connects each input to the store. So the basic usage, how we can use the field component, we can have multiple attributes with the field component. For example, name, component, type. So what it is doing over here, it creates an HTML input element of type text. As you can see over here, the type we are passing is as text. It also passes additional props such as value, on change, on blur. All these props we can pass it to the field component. Those are used to track and maintain the input state under the hood. Now we'll understand more this particular step with the code snippet. So as you can see over here at the top, what we are doing is we are importing the React, we are importing the field and the Redux form from Redux form. And we have a props here on which we have a handle submit function. And this is the form. As you can see over here, the form component, the form element, specifically the HTML form element, in which I'm passing label fields and the multiple div structure, the HTML div structure. And at the end, I'm using the Redux form function. And the contact which I have created, I'm using it once. So from now on, now the store now, and it should be populated based on the action coming from your form component. Now we can handle the submission now. So now this is the fourth step, and I'll say this is the last step, that how the React Redux forms handle the submission. Now reacting to the submit, when a user clicks on the submit button. So let's say we have two buttons, submit and cancel on our form. and when user clicks on the submit button, how React Redux reacts to this event. So the submitted data is passed as JSON object to your onSubmit function. So we have an onSubmit function in which the data is passed as JSON object. So this is the onSubmit function where we are passing the data in the JSON object. Now, all these are the 4 steps. I am repeating once again all the things which we have discussed. So we started with Redux form, that how we can use the Redux forms, what all things are required to combine the React components with the Redux store. So we talked about the form reducer function, we talked about the Redux form function, and we talked about the field component. So that is how we saw the step 1, that is a form, that was the form reducer, form component, and the form field components. Now let's talk about how we can validate the form. We can also validate form because validation plays an important role of ensuring what user has entered or the user types the right information in the required format. So how we can add a simple validation into the Redux form. So as you can see in the code snippet, what I'm saying, if not values.brand, then error should come as required. So for example, I have a value field. If I'm not passing the values.brand, then it should come as required error. The validation should be there that it is a required field because I'm not passing anything in that. If I'm keeping it blank and I'm clicking on the submit button, it should give me a validation message or an error message that this is a required field or the mandatory field. So that is how we can pass the validations, which we will see later in the code. Now, handling the form submittal. Redux form is only responsible for the handling the state and the validation. This is very important to understand because apart from these two functions, the Redux form is not doing anything. It is only responsible for your handling the state, the current client state, and the validation part. So for form submittal, we have a prop, which is the handle submit. It is defined with the React libraries. It is a prop, which is defined as handle submit. So when we define the form, so on submit, we pass it as a prop in the curly braces handle submit. If we need to submit the data to the backend server, the user needs to write a custom function inside the handle submit. So this we talked about the handling form submittal in React Redux forms. Now, before going to this, let's see a demo over here. Yeah. So I have created a simple form. This is a very simple form. Let me do this. Very simple. Yeah. Yes, all the libraries have been downloaded. Yes. So let's talk about what are the dependencies required to create this simple form. So all these are the NPM packages which I've included, the React, React DOM, React Redux form. All these are the various dependencies which I've included for creating the simple form. And 4 JS files I have created. So the main file is the index.js, which I'll talk later. I'll start with the store.js JavaScript file which I've created. So what it is doing is that it is combining the reducers. I am calling the combined reducers from Redux. Then I have the show results.js. This is again another JS file which I've created just to displaying the results. Then I have a simple form.js. This is very important to understand that I am importing the field which we talk about, the field component, the Redux form function from the Redux form library. Here I am creating a very simple form by providing the props. In this props, we have a handle submit function. Now in this form, what I am doing is I am creating the HTML, and on submit, I am calling a prop, which is the handle submit, which we saw in the slide just now. So this is the complete form which I have created. It is not having any validations as of now. Validation we will see later. It is not having any validation. I am just simply creating a very simple form. So as you can see, various HTML form elements I have used. So I have used 2 buttons. One is the submit button, as you can see over here, and one is the clear values. Now, the beauty of this is that, as I said, this is maintaining the state on the client side. So now, as you can see, now we'll see the output of this particular code, this code which we have written. And in the index.js, what I'm doing is I'm just calling all these JS files which I have created. So first I have created the store.js. So I'm importing it just like this, importing a store from store, then show results.js, and then the simple form.js. So these are the 3 JS which I created beforehand, and then I'm calling in my main JS file, that is the index.js. And I'm using React DOM.render, which is the basic functions required to render the DOM elements on our application. And I'm using the simple form component with the values. So let's talk about the output here. So now here, beauty you can see of this React Redux form is, since I have not written anything, it is giving me the values as undefined. The moment I start writing anything, let's say I write first name as, let's say, Vipul. Now, as you can see, it has started creating the JSON object. As you can see here at the below, the first name is Vipul. Let's say I'm writing my last name as Chen. Now, as you can see beautifully on the browser itself, on the client side itself, because as I said, the JavaScript now are taking the JavaScript libraries are now taking the responsibilities of handling this client inputs from the user, and it is passing the JSON object. As you can see, the first name, the last name, my email, let's say I have written an email. So it is creating or building the JSON object for me, which I will pass to the store and which will get passed to the ReactJS view components. So let's say I have filled this form, since there is no as such validation as of now. When let's say I am writing a note, a very big string, let's say if I write this is a webinar on React plus Redux Forms. So as you can see, the moment I'm typing over here, it is building a JSON object for me. So as you can see over here, notes is an attribute in this particular JSON object and is having the value as webinar on React plus Redux form, which I've just written in this form. So when I click on submit, let's talk about the submission of this form. When I click on submit, okay, now it is giving me that you have submitted this particular JSON object, and this particular JSON objects get submitted to the store. So that is how the React Redux forms works. I'm going back to the slides. Now we'll talk about the validation part. So till here, I'm just recapping it once again, whatever we have discussed. So till here, because this is the last section of this particular webinar, the submit validation. So till here, what we have discussed, we talked about Redux, what Redux is and how it is helpful and why we need Redux forms. Why we can't go ahead with in the complex scenarios only with the React HTML form elements, why we need the Redux forms. Now, how Redux works. So we talked about the actions, we talked about the store, and we talked about the reducers. These are the three main components for any Redux application. Then we saw that how data flows in a unidirectional fashion from action till React library in Redux architecture. And then we talked about the React Redux forms, that what all are the three main components required for creating a simple React Redux form. Okay, now we'll talk about the Redux form submit validation. So we have created a simple form. Just now we saw that, as here I'll show again, that we created this simple form using the React Redux libraries, and we had four JS files: store.js, showresults.js, simpleform.js, and in the main JS file, that is the index.js, all these three files I'm calling, or specifically I'm importing. So I'm importing store.js, which I have written over here, the showresults.js, which I have written here, and the last, the simple form, which is having all the main components and the complete HTML structure of the simple form. And this is the output of this simple form. And we also saw that how JSON object is getting created on the client side itself. But here we have not talked about the validation part. So let's talk about the validation part now, the form validation. So the recommended way, I'll say the recommended way to do server-side validation with when we are working with React Redux form is to return a rejected promise from the on-submit function. We saw the on-submit function, which is having the handle submit prop. So there are two ways to give Redux forms a function to run when your forms get submitted. So when you click on the submit form for applying the validation, there are two ways. So first, pass it as an on-submit prop to your decorated component, in which case you would use the on submit equal to this.props.handle submit inside your decorated component to cause it to fire when the submit button is clicked. So the first way of doing it, that just on the button click, on the click of the submit button, just pass this on submit with this.props.handle submit inside the component. The second way, pass it as a parameter. Pass it as a parameter to the this.props.handle submit function from your component. So in this case, you would use on click, not the on submit. Just see the difference. There are two differences over here in these two methods of submit validation. The first one is the on submit, where you are passing it as a prop this.props.handle submit inside the component. The second way is on click. On clicking of the button, the submit button, you are passing it as this.props.handle submit, and you are passing input parameter to this particular prop or to this particular function inside the component to cause it to fire when the submit button is clicked. So these are the two ways. More generally, I will say that this is the first one is the more general way of using the handle submit. Now let's talk about the form. The form which we saw that if I have written a brand Nike category sports, size is 10. So the JSON object is getting created with the values. So what we did is we created a form which can be used to place the shoe orders, for example. So we have three fields: brand, category, and size. And this form contains a submit button and the clear values, let's say the reset button. So now when you are passing the brand as blank and category is also blank, so we are prompting the user with the error message when any field is left blank. So in the JSON object, only the data which you have passed will get added as an object and not the other null values or the blank values. It is, we are giving a validation error over here that these two fields are also required, which are brand and category. Okay, now how this submit validation works. We'll see now in this particular slide, we'll see that how this submit validation work, and then we'll see that how validation works in a demo. So what we are doing in this particular code snippets, we are just saying it that we have created a submit.js. We have two JS files here. One is the submit validation form.js and another one is submit.js. So first we are creating this submit.js. What we are doing over here is we are saying this, we have created a function submit, just taking the input parameter as values. So what it is saying is that if the user is not John, Paul, George, or Ringo, the user will get a message that user does not exist or the login failed. Else, the login will be successful. Provided the password is, I'm using the password, let's say Redux form. If password is something else, again, the login will fail. It will show us the message that the wrong password and how it is getting handled. Now we have one more JS, which is submit validation form.js, in which, as you can see at the top over here, we are calling our submit.js import submit from submit. Now here we have a render field, this render field component. The render field component has the props which we receive from the field. It is having multiple props which we have received from the field. Now the handle submit function, which take care, as we saw that this handle submit function, it takes care of the submission behavior. So as you can see over here on submit, I am passing the handle submit. Now how I am connecting the form component. So for connecting the form component to the Redux, I'm decorating it with a high order component Redux form over here. So that is how we can create the validation in React Redux Form. Now let's quickly see the output of this particular code example. I created a submit.js where I'm writing the logic of the submit button, that if the username and password matches, then the login will be successful or authentication will be successful, else it will get failed. And how I'm managing it using the render field component and the handle submit, which actually take care of the submission behavior. And finally, I am connecting the form component, this is the form component. I am connecting the form component to Redux by decorating it with high order component, you can say here Redux form. Now let's see the output. So this is the output of this particular code example. So this is the form which I created having a username and password. As you can see, what I'm doing is I'm creating two fields over here. As you can see in this field, name equal to username, type equal to text, component equal to render field, label equal to username. So I have two labels, two fields, as you can see over here. Two labels are username and password. Two fields, username and password, having multiple attributes. The attributes is name, type. What is the type? So type is text, type is password, and component I am passing it as the render field component. Then I have two buttons. One is the login button, another is the clear values button. So as you can see in this code, I have created two buttons. The one name is login, another name is clear values. So this is a very simple form with validation. Now let's see what happens when I pass a wrong username and password. So let's say I have passed the username as Vipul and the password, let's say I have used as new user at the rate 123. Now, as you can see in the code, if I go back, we set to the submit function that if it is not John, Paul, George, or Ringo, this is the username, that is the values.username object, it should give us the error, user does not exist. And if the password which we set in our code is redux-form, if the password is something else, which I'm using as something else, let's say new user at the rate 123, it will again give me the password error, the wrong password, which is happening in this particular snapshot. As you can see, I'm providing the username as Vipul, the password as something else apart from redux-form. It is giving me a validation error that username and password does not match. As you can see over here, user does not exist and the login failed. Now let's see if I pass the correct values in the username and password fields, what happens. Let's see in the next slide. Wow, the authentication has been successful, or the login has been successful. As you can see, I'm passing the John as username and the password as Redux-Form. You can see on the client itself, the JSON object itself, what I'm passing to the password field. So username is John, so password is Redux Form. And when I click on login, so this is the message which I'm seeing on my screen. You submitted username John, password is this, which suggests us that the login has been successful and it is working as per our code snippet which we have given. Now quickly let's see the demo of this particular example. Okay, so this is just a Babel compiler which I generally use to show the demos. This is the username, email, and age. 3 input elements I have created. This is the output of the form. Username, email, and age. And this is the particular CSS which I am using. And let's talk about the code. First of all, this is the code which I am using. So const component React and React Redux. So I am creating the form component over here. This is the form component having the HTML which I've used. And for the validation, I am using this particular form. As you can see this code which I've written, there are buttons, button type equal to submit, and this is the final you can say the component which is calling the all other components, the provider, the user form, and in the react dom.render I'm calling this final component app to show in the app area of my application. So let's talk about the output here. So if I'm not passing any output, let's say for example I'm not passing any input to the username field, let's say over here, and this we are talking about the synchronous validation. So if I click on submit, see it is giving me that username is required. Please fill out this field which I have added in my code. So this is a kind of synchronous validations which we can use with the React Redux forms. Let's talk about one more example. This is the last example for today. So here, as I said in the previous example, username could be John, Paul, George, or Ringo. And let's say I've changed the password now. Let's say I write here Vipul and password, let's say old user. If I click on login, see it says login failed, user does not exist. So this is kind of validations, very beautiful validations we can do with the React Redux form. And let's say if I give the correct inputs, that is a John, and it is asking for the password as Beatles, Beagles, and if I click on login, it is giving me the message successfully submitted on the screen, which means that it has understood the username and password and the authentication of the user is successful. So that's all about this particular webinar on React Redux Forms. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply to them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to our Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!